The cargo locker smelled like synthetic rubber and old protein bars, and Ro Dalton had his entire upper body inside it. His boots were the only thing visible from the corridor. They shifted left, then right, then left again as he dug through the locker with the focused determination of a man who had not eaten since the third jump and was starting to feel it in a personal way. "There is nothing in there," Yara said from the corridor wall, arms crossed, watching his boots. "I already checked." "You checked for you," Rose said, his voice muffled by the locker. "I checked for me. Different standards. We have the same stomach, Ro. We are the same species." "Debatable." He emerged holding half a nutrition block wrapped in foil that had been opened, resealed with a piece of tape, and forgotten about for what looked like several weeks. He examined it. He peeled back the tape. Yara made a face. "Do not." He ate it in 2 bites. It tasted like cardboard that had briefly been near something sweet. He seemed satisfied. That was the moment Commander Oren found them. She was a Kalid, which meant she had 4 arms, gray-green skin, and the permanent expression of someone managing a headache that had been going on for years. She was also the commanding officer of the GCS Perseverance, and when she came looking for someone, she usually had news. She looked at Ro. She looked at the empty foil wrapper. She closed her eyes for a moment. "I need the crew in the briefing room," she said. The briefing room held 8 people comfortably. With the full crew and one very unhappy Thurani diplomat already seated at the far end of the table, it held 10 people and a great deal of tension. The diplomat's name was Velsu. He was tall, pale, and dressed in formal gray robes that probably cost more than the ship's secondary engine. He had the kind of stillness that came from spending decades in rooms where behavior was measured and remembered. He watched the crew file in with careful eyes. His gaze stopped on Ro. Ro had crumbs on his collar. Velsu looked at Oren. Something passed between them that did not require words. Oren pulled up the briefing display. A structure appeared on the screen that Ro did not recognize, but which made every non-human crew member go very quiet very fast. It was enormous, shaped like a closed fist of dark stone, ringed with geometric carvings that covered every surface. "The Chamber of Final Reckoning," Oren said. "We have been summoned." Nobody spoke. Ro leaned toward Yara. "Is that good?" he whispered. "It is not bad," she whispered back. "It is just very, very large." Oren explained the situation in the clipped, direct way she handled most things. The Perseverance had been selected as a neutral carrier vessel. 2 major galactic powers, the Thurani Collective and the Sorath Alliance, were bringing a territorial dispute to the Chamber for resolution. The dispute had been running for 60 years. The Chamber had agreed to hear it. A neutral human vessel with mixed diplomatic observers had been requested specifically because humans had no stake in the outcome and no recorded history of faction bias. "We are useful because we don't care," Yara murmured. "I care," Rose said. "I just don't know what I'm supposed to care about yet." Velsu, who had hearing sharp enough to catch this, turned and stared at Ro with an expression that suggested the next several days were going to be difficult for him personally. Oren distributed printed copies of the Codes of Solemn Attendance, a formal document governing behavior inside the chamber. It was 42 pages long. Ro accepted his copy, looked at the first page, and used the document to fan his face because the briefing room was warm. Velsu watched this happen. He made a small sound at the back of his throat that may have been distress. "The codes govern everything inside the chamber," Oren said. "Silence during proceedings. No movement unless directed. No consumption of any kind. No informal communication between parties." She paused. "No informal communication between anyone." Ro put the document flat on the table and looked at her seriously. "Define informal." "Talking," Yara said. "She means talking. I don't talk that much." Several people at the table said nothing, which was itself a kind of answer. After the briefing, Velsu approached Oren near the door. He kept his voice low, but not low enough. "Commander, I understand the selection parameters, but I want to formally request that the human crew be positioned in the rear observer gallery, away from the primary floor." "Noted," Oren said, "and perhaps away from the secondary floor as well." "Also noted. And if there is a tertiary, Velsu," Oren looked at him directly. "My crew will behave." Velsu looked past her to where Ro was now standing at the viewport, eating a second nutrition block he had apparently found in a jacket pocket, leaving small crumbs on the floor of a ship that was about to dock with the most sacred diplomatic location in the known galaxy. Velsu said nothing. He simply turned and walked to his quarters, moving like a man preparing himself for something unavoidable. 3 hours later, the Perseverance entered the approach corridor to the chamber. The structure filled the viewport completely. Up close, it was genuinely breathtaking. The carvings told the history of 4,000 years of resolved conflicts. The stone glowed faintly with something that was not quite light. It had a gravity to it that had nothing to do with physics. Rose stood at the viewport and looked at it for a long time. "It looks like a big fancy hat," he said. Yara put her face in her hands. The docking clamps engaged with a low, heavy sound. The formal robes did not fit Ro correctly. They were standard-issue diplomatic dress, pulled from the Perseverance's small supply of ceremonial clothing for occasions that required more than a crew uniform. On Yara, they looked sharp and professional. On Ro, the collar sat slightly crooked. One shoulder was a centimeter lower than the other, and no matter how many times he adjusted the front clasp, it kept sliding just far enough to look like he had dressed quickly in the dark. Yara fixed his collar for the third time in the docking corridor. "Stop touching your face," she said. "I'm not touching my face. You're going to touch your face. I can see it in your posture. Do not touch your face inside the chamber. What if my face itches?" She stared at him. He stared back. She turned and walked toward the chamber entrance. Velsu was waiting at the threshold with the other delegates. He had changed into a second set of robes, even more formal than the first, with silver trim along the edges that caught the low light of the entrance hall. He looked exactly like someone who belonged in this place. That he looked at Ro's crooked collar. He turned away without saying anything. This was, somehow, worse than if he had said something. The entrance hall of the chamber was made of black stone that had a faint blue sheen when the light hit it from certain angles. The ceiling was high enough that looking up caused a mild sense of vertigo. Every surface was carved. Every carving meant something. Velsu had told them this in the briefing. He had also said that discussing the carvings during the approach was considered disrespectful, so they were meant to simply look and move. The warden met them at the inner gate. It was difficult to describe the warden in terms that landed properly in the mind. It was old in the way that some buildings are old, not just in years, but in purpose. It had been here longer than any living diplomat. It had seen more resolutions than any living historian. It moved slowly and spoke slowly, and when it looked at you with the full weight of everything it represented. It began to speak. The welcoming address of the Chamber of Final Reckoning was a speech that had been delivered at the start of every session for 4,000 years. It had never been changed. Not one word. The warden recited it now in a voice that resonated in the chest more than in the ears, speaking of history and weight, and the responsibility of those who stood in this place to carry themselves as the settlement of this conflict deserved. It was a remarkable speech. Every delegate in the hall stood perfectly still, affected by it in visible ways. Velsu had his eyes closed. Two of the Sorith delegates had their hands pressed together in a gesture of formal acknowledgement. Commander Oren stood with her forearms at her sides, posture straight, expression composed and respectful. Ro was looking at the floor, not out of disrespect. He was genuinely interested in the floor. The stone was a type he had not seen before, and when he shifted his weight slightly from one foot to the other, he could feel that it was cooler than the air around it in a way that seemed intentional. He wondered what was underneath it, whether the whole structure was built on bedrock or something else. Yara noticed him looking at the floor and pressed two fingers very lightly into his arm. He looked up. The warden was still speaking. He straightened his posture and looked forward. After the address, the warden led them into the Hall of Silence. This was a corridor that connected the entrance hall to the chamber itself. It was perhaps 60 meters long, lined on both sides with tall, narrow panels of dark glass. The acoustic design of the hall had been built specifically to amplify sound in a way that underlined the solemnity of the approach. Complete silence had been maintained in this corridor for the entirety of the chamber's history. The delegation moved through it in a single line. No one breathed, too loudly. Feet were placed with care. Even the rustle of formal robes seemed like too much in this space. They were about 30 meters in when it happened that IT was not loud in the way that a shout is loud. It was low, long, and textured in a way that made it somehow worse. Ro's stomach growled. The Hall of Silence took this sound and did what it was designed to do with sounds. It carried it. It gave it shape. It let everyone present understand, with complete acoustic clarity, exactly what had just happened and exactly who had caused it. The line did not stop moving. Stopping would have required a reason, and no one wanted to officially acknowledge the reason. But several heads turned just slightly, the way heads turn when they're trying not to turn. The warden at the front of the line kept walking. Its pace did not change. This was either professionalism or a coping mechanism. Possibly both. Ro mouthed the word sorry in the general direction of no one specific. The warden did not turn around. It had no framework for sorry. In 4,000 years of welcoming delegations into this hall, it had never needed one that they reached the chamber doors. Two slabs of dark stone, each the height of 3 Kaled, standing on each other's shoulders, carved edge to edge with the history of every conflict resolved within. Ro looked at Yara and very quietly pointed to his jacket pocket. She shook her head once. He considered this. The doors opened without sound. The inside of the chamber was the kind of place that made people feel small on purpose, not in a cruel way, in a deliberate one. The ceiling was so high it was barely visible. The circular floor was inlaid with thousands of names, each one marking a conflict that had been resolved in this room across 4 millennia. The light came from sources that could not be located, warm and even, with no shadows. The seating in the observer gallery curved along the upper tier in a gentle arc, and every surface, every angle, every proportion had been calculated to make the people inside it understand that they were participating in something much larger than themselves. Ro sat down in the observer gallery, put both hands on his knees, and tried to look like he belonged there. He did not look like he belonged there. He looked like a man who was trying. Yara sat beside him. She had her formal posture on, the kind that said she was aware of how she looked at all times. She glanced at him once, assessed the situation, and looked forward. Below them, on the main floor, High Arbiter Doss took the elevated seat at the center of the chamber. Doss was a species Ro had not encountered before, broad across the shoulders with 4 eyes arranged in a wide, flat arc across the top of a large head, and robes of deep red that pooled slightly on the steps of the raised platform. Doss opened the proceedings. The opening declaration of context was, by all accounts, one of the shorter ones in recent memory. It still took 40 minutes. It covered the 60-year history of the territorial dispute between the Thurani Collective and the Sorith Alliance, the prior attempts at resolution, the formal request for chamber intervention, the legal basis of both claims, and the procedural framework that would govern the session. Ro listened to the first 12 minutes carefully. He listened to the next 8 with slightly less focus. By minute 25, he was watching the carved panels on the far wall and thinking about the cooling properties of the floor in the Hall of Silence, which led him to thinking about thermal architecture generally, which led him to wondering what he was going to eat when this was over, which led him to his jacket pocket. He had put the small bag there before leaving the ship. It was a mix of dried fruit and grain clusters, the kind that came in sealed portions from the ship's food stores. He had grabbed it the way a person grabbed the jacket, automatically, because he always had something in his pockets and his hands had known he would want it eventually. He had forgotten it was there when they entered the Hall of Silence. He remembered it now. The proceedings continued below. The first representative of the Thurani delegation was speaking in the formal, ritualized language of the chamber, referencing navigational charts and resource surveys from 5 decades ago. It was clearly going to take a while. Ro thought about the BAG.IT was small, the kind with a resealable top. If he opened it with one hand, slowly, along the seam, using his thumb to ease the seal apart rather than pulling from the corner, the noise would be minimal, that he reasoned with himself. The gallery was a separate level. The chamber had a high ceiling. Sound traveled up more than it carried horizontally at this elevation. Probably. He reached into his jacket pocket. He found the bag. He felt the top seal with his thumb and pressed gently along one end of the crease, The way you did was something you did not want to make noise with. He pressed. The seal held. He pressed a little more firmly. The bag crinkled. I in the chamber of final reckoning, which had been acoustically engineered over 40 centuries to ensure that every word spoken on the main floor could be heard clearly by every observer and participant. The crinkle of a small food bag in the upper gallery did not go unnoticed. IT went everywhere. IT was not a loud sound in isolation. It was the kind of sound that was only significant in the context of where it had been made, at what moment, and in what kind of silence it had interrupted. The chamber took it and gave it the full weight of the space. It arrived in the ears of every person present not as a sound, but as an event. The Thurani representative stopped speaking. High Arbiter Doss stopped writing. Velsu, seated in the lower observer section, went very still in a way that was different from his usual stillness. His usual stillness was dignity. This was something else. 114 heads turned toward the upper gallery. Ro was sitting with the bag in his hand, the top seal halfway open. He looked at the faces below. They looked at him. The silence that followed the crinkle was somehow louder than the crinkle itself. He looked down at the bag. He looked at the High Arbiter. He looked at the warden, standing near the side wall, who was watching him with the expression of something experiencing a completely new category of problem. He looked at the young aide seated at the back of the Sorth delegation table, who had been sitting in rigid ceremony for 4 hours and looked like he had not eaten either. Ro held up the bag. He gave a small, honest shrug that he mouthed. "Does anyone want some?" Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Yara closed her eyes. The silence that followed had a texture to it. Not the silence of the Hall of Silence, which was designed and maintained and purposeful. This was the silence of 114 people processing the same piece of information at the same time and arriving at the same conclusion, which was that something unprecedented had occurred and none of them had a procedure for it. High Arbiter Doss had been presiding over sessions in this chamber for 22 years. In 22 years, Doss had seen disputes that had lasted generations reach resolution, had witnessed tears, formal declarations, the signing of agreements that ended suffering that had lasted longer than some species' recorded histories. Had never, not once, called a recess. Doss looked at the bag in Ro's hand. Doss looked at the warden. The warden looked back. The warden had been in this chamber for longer than Doss had been alive. It had seen things that had no precedent in its record, but very few of them, and none of them had involved dried fruit in the upper gallery. Velsu, in the lower observer section, had not moved. He was the stillest thing in the room. He was still in the way that a person goes still when they have been preparing for years for a specific kind of disaster, and the disaster has finally arrived, and it is somehow both exactly what they feared and also slightly different, which makes it worse. He had read reports on human behavior before this assignment. He had studied them carefully. The reports had noted things like unpredictable under pressure, strong social bonding instincts, tendency to treat unfamiliar situations with practical rather than ceremonial responses. He had read all of this and thought he understood what it meant. He understood now that he had not understood. Commander Oren was sitting 2 seats from Velsu. She was completely still in a different way from his stillness. His was the stillness of distress. Hers was the stillness of a commanding officer who has identified a situation, is currently computing every available option, and has not yet decided which one to execute. She looked at Ro. Ro, who still had the bag in his hand, who was now just sitting there with the patient, uncomplicated energy of a man waiting to see what happened next. Then Ro looked at the young aide at the back of the Sorth delegation table. The aide's name, though Ro did not know it, was Ferris. And Ferris was 19 standard years old and had been selected for this assignment because of exceptional academic scores and near-perfect formal behavior scores in every training assessment. Ferris had been sitting in full ceremonial posture for 4 hours and 11 minutes. Ferris had not eaten since the morning. Ferris was at the point of hunger where it had stopped being a feeling and it started being a background condition, like weather. Ferris was watching the bag. Ro stood up from his seat. He did not make a speech. He did not gesture dramatically. He walked along the gallery tier, came down the connecting steps at the side, and crossed the lower floor to where the Sorth delegation table sat. He moved the way he moved everywhere, like someone walking to a kitchen at a reasonable pace with a reasonable purpose. He stopped at the edge of the table. He set a small handful of grain clusters on the corner of Ferris's ceremonial podium, not in front of him, not pushed toward him, just placed there in the space beside his right hand, where they could be seen and reached or ignored. He looked at Ferris once, briefly, the way you look at someone when you're offering something and you want them to know they do not have to take it. Then he walked back to the gallery. Ferris stared at the grain clusters. They were small and pale and irregular in shape, and smelled faintly of something sweet. Every instinct from 4 years of training said to leave them there untouched. Every other instinct, the older and simpler kind that preceded training by several millennia of biology, said something different. Ferris picked one up, that he ate it, that he was very quiet about it. Very dignified. He placed it in his mouth with the same precise movement he used for everything in this room, and he chewed without any outward expression, and he looked straight ahead at the main floor. But the delegates on either side of him had seen it. The delegates behind them had seen it. Several aides and junior observers from both factions who had been sitting in motionless ceremony since morning had seen it, and something passed through the room that was not exactly permission, but was adjacent to it. Doss watched all of this. Then Doss looked at the warden. The warden looked back. "The session will recess," Doss said. The words landed in the chamber like a stone dropped into deep water. No one said anything because no one had words for it. A recess. In the chamber of final reckoning. The chamber had not recessed in 4,000 years. There was not even a formal procedure for how to recess. Doss simply stood, descended the steps, and walked to the side corridor, and after a moment, everyone else did too. The warden went to the far wall and stood with its back to the room. IT needed a moment. IT had never needed a moment before. Rose sat back down in the gallery, opened his bag the rest of the way, and ate a grain cluster. He offered one to Yara. She took it. She was not going to admit she was hungry, but she took it. Nobody knew what to do in the vestibule. This was not a social problem in the ordinary sense. The delegates and observers who had filed out of the chamber during the recess were, individually, some of the most experienced diplomatic minds in the known galaxy. They had spent their careers in formal settings, navigating complex situations with precision and purpose, but those skills assumed a structure, a procedure, something to follow. The vestibule had none of that right now. It was just a large stone room with carved walls and very good lighting and approximately 40 people standing in it with no script. For the first several minutes, no one spoke. People stood near the walls or in small clusters, waiting for someone else to begin. The silence had a different quality from the Hall of Silence. That silence had been imposed. This one was just awkward. Ro found a ledge along one wall that was the right height to sit on. He sat on it. He ate a grain cluster. He looked around the room without urgency. Yara stood beside him, radiating a very specific type of stress that she had developed over years of working near him. It was not anger. It was the stress of someone who could see something happening in slow motion and understood that there was nothing to be done about it now. Then something unexpected started to occur. That IT started small. Ferris, the young Sorith aide, had followed the delegation out and was standing near a pillar. A Thurani aide a similar age had ended up near the same pillar, neither of them intentionally, both of them just looking for somewhere to stand. They did not speak at first, but they were both standing in the same posture of someone who was tired and hungry and unsure what was expected of them, and that common posture was a kind of conversation by itself. The Thurani aide looked at Ferris. Ferris looked back. "That was grain clusters," the Thurani aide said quietly. Ferris nodded. "From a human." Ferris nodded again. They stood in silence for another moment. Then the Thurani aide said, still quietly, "I have not eaten since the second departure." Ferris said, "Third departure for me." They stood together after that with the specific solidarity of people who are hungry in a formal setting and have found someone else who is also hungry in a formal setting. Across the vestibule, something similar was happening at a different level. The senior Thurani representative, a woman named Adra who had been in formal diplomatic service for 31 years, had ended up standing near the senior Sorith delegate, a man named Call who had been in service almost as long. They had spent the last 4 hours on opposite sides of a floor reciting formal positions at each other. Now they were just two middle-aged people standing in a stone vestibule. Adra said, to no one in particular, "We were at the same academy." Call looked at her. "The Delaney Institute. I remember you," she said. "You were terrible at navigational theory." He was quiet for a moment. "I still am." He said that IT was not a peace treaty. It was not a resolution. It was just two people who had known each other a long time ago, before they became the symbols they were required to be in the chamber, briefly being something other than symbols. Velsu walked toward Ro. He had the look of a man who had prepared a speech and was now uncertain whether to deliver it. He stopped a few feet away. Ro looked up from his bag. Velsu opened his mouth. Something came out that was not the speech he had prepared. "How?" he said carefully. "Are you not afraid?" Ro looked at him. He thought about it honestly, which took a moment. "I was a little nervous walking in," he said. "That ceiling is very high and I don't love heights. But mostly I was just hungry, and being hungry is harder to ignore than being nervous." Velsu had no response to this. He had spent 30 years as a diplomat. He had responses for most things. He did not have one for this. He sat down on the ledge beside Ro. Ro offered him the bag. Velsu looked at it. He had very clear feelings about what the bag had done to the last 4 hours of his professional life. He also had not eaten since morning. He took 2 grain clusters. He ate one. He held the other in his hand and looked at the vestibule around him. The aides near the pillar were talking properly now, still quiet but real. Adra and Call were standing at an angle toward each other rather than away. Velsu said nothing for a while. Then, "You were not trying to do anything." "I was trying to open a bag quietly," Ro said. "Yes." Velsu looked at the grain cluster in his hand. "I know." There was a long pause. 30 years, Velsu said finally. 30 years I have been in rooms where everything was calculation, where every word and every movement was chosen for effect. He looked at Ro with an expression that was hard to name. "And you opened a food bag." "I was hungry," Ro said simply. Velsu ate the second grain cluster. He did not say anything else that he did not need to. From the corridor, Das appeared in the doorway. The recess was ending. People began to move back toward the chamber doors, still quiet, but different in their quiet now than they had been before. Adra and Call walked back in side by side. The resumed session felt different, and everyone knew it, and no one said so. The formal language was unchanged. The ceremonial structure was the same. Das presided from the same elevated seat in the same red robes and spoke in the same measured cadence that had governed the proceedings before the recess. On the surface, nothing was different, but Adra and Call were not reciting positions at each other across a floor anymore. They were still formal. They were still precise. But there was something in the way they spoke now that was less like two symbols in opposition and more like two people with a disagreement that they both wanted to resolve. The shift was subtle enough that it could not be officially noted. It was real enough that Das noticed it within the first 10 minutes. Das had presided over 1,004 sessions. Das could measure the quality of a negotiation the way a person with experience measures weather, by feeling rather than instrument. What was happening on the main floor now was not the same thing that had been happening 4 hours at T took 2 hours. That was fast for what it was. 60 years of dispute. 2 competing claims over a stretch of deep space with navigational and resource significance to both factions. Compromises that neither side had been willing to discuss in prior formal settings, because prior formal settings had kept them performing their positions rather than solving their problem. The resolution was real. Not a deferral, not a postponement. An actual framework signed by both senior delegates and witnessed by the chamber. Das brought the gavel down. It was a formal instrument, old, made of the same dark stone as the chamber walls. The sound it made when it struck the platform was low and resonant and final in the best possible way. Das then did something that had not been done in recorded session history. After the formal closing declaration, Das looked up at the observer gallery and paused for a moment. "This session was unusual," Das said. "Unusual is not always unwelcome." No further explanation was given. None was needed. Das stepped down from the platform. The warden waited near the side corridor as the delegation prepared to depart. It had been standing in various states of processing for several hours now and had arrived at something like composure, though the composure was sitting on top of something that was still adjusting. When Roe passed, the warden stopped him with a raised hand. Roe stopped. The warden looked at him with the full gravity of 4,000 years of institutional purpose. It said, "You violated 17 codes of solemn attendance during this session." Roe said, "I'm sorry about that." The warden absorbed the apology. It filed it in a category it was still building. Then it said, "The chamber maintains an archive of every session. Every significant event within a session is formally recorded." It paused. "What you introduced into the proceedings will be recorded." Roe blinked. "The snack, the item," the warden said, with the careful precision of something that was going to put this in a document and wanted the document to be accurate, "will be described by its proper name." What was it called? Roe thought for a moment. "Grain and fruit clusters. Standard ship store portion." The warden produced a stylus from within its robes. It wrote this down on a small flat tablet, each stroke deliberate and careful, the way it wrote down everything that went into the archive. It wrote grain and fruit clusters. It wrote standard portion. It looked at what it had written. It put the tablet away. It looked at Roe one more time with an expression that contained several things at once. The weight of 4,000 years of unbroken ceremony, the particular kind of tiredness that came from having a framework disrupted by something it had no category for, and somewhere underneath both of those things, something that was not quite the opposite of disapproval. "You may go," the warden said. Outside, in the approach corridor, the delegation broke into smaller groups, heading toward their respective vessels. Velsu fell in a step beside Roe, without quite appearing to choose to do so, that he walked in silence for a while. Then he said, "You are the most irresponsible, undignified, and accidentally effective diplomat I have ever encountered." Roe considered this. "Thank you." Yara, one step behind them, said, "That was not a compliment. It sounded like one." It was not. It had the shape of one. Velsu kept walking. He did not agree with either of them. He also did not disagree, which was close enough. Back on the Perseverance, Commander Orrin sat at her desk and opened the mission report form. The fields were standard. Date, duration, outcome, notable incidents. She filled in the first three without stopping. She stopped at notable incidents. She typed for a while. Then she read what she had typed. Then she deleted it. Then she typed again, shorter this time. Then she deleted that too. She sat for a moment looking at the blank field. She typed, "Crew performed within acceptable parameters. One dietary incident. No casualties. Outcome. Favorable." She stared at it. She saved it. She closed the file. She went to the galley to find something to eat. She did not think about what had happened. She thought about it the entire time.